Hello. Thank you very much again for inviting me to this esteemed group, to Jackie and the team. Some of you I can see in the audience I know. It's always nice to follow such an esteemed professor and fantastically well-crafted talk. So thank you again, Professor. Some of you may have seen aspects of this talk in the past, but I feel that it's so important to talk about it that I want to continue to hit it home. This is really the future and probably one of the biggest, I would say, megatrends that we will experience in our lifetimes. And it is the megatrend of longevity. It will change everything that we understand about how we live over the next hundreds of years. It will change in paradigm shifts how we live our lives. So to basically give you an idea, everything about longevity is really what my career is now focusing on. I'm trained as a surgeon and a medic, trained in the UK. I worked in emergency medicine. I've worked within the forces of the police in the UK for about 10 constabularies. I've also worked now for the past 10 years here in Thailand at the intersection of well-being and hospitality. I've been responsible for building some of the largest projects in the world, including a very large project in China where I was just prior to the pandemic, which is called Sangha. I've worked on projects in Europe, and then I've helped to build projects here in Thailand and continue to do that. So I'm now live here in Bangkok. My children are here at Patana, and we're loving living here in your amazing country, and we're looking forward to helping to build a fine future. What is longevity? Longevity, as I said, means different things to different people. But to me, it means that the latter part of our lives are spent not in the hospital, and it's not the number of years that you live. It's that those years are healthy. So how do we have a long life? So over 80 years is the projected life expectancy for most of us in this room. In 1920, that life expectancy was somewhere in the 50s. Today, as I said, it's over 80. And by 2060, most of us will be over 65 and will outnumber the number of children. So what's pushing all of this? Mainly that we can now understand that aging, or what we understand as aging, can be treated as a disease. And this is what the professor was a little bit talking about before. Many conditions thought to be inevitable are now some conditions that we can treat. I speak specifically of things like cerebrovascular disease, heart disease, osteoporosis. There are a few axioms of how we can treat things. And they're mainly centered around how we live our lives, where we live our lives, what we drink, how much exercise we have, and how reactive we are with our healthcare. If we're reactive versus proactive, we're going to get sick. But if we're proactive and we're looking at and thinking about our bodies and using our bodies to tell us what to do, then we're going to prevent disease. Next slide. This is probably the most important slide on the deck. Today's typical life, we live to about 75, 80 years of age. At about 60, we start to have some issues. I'm getting there in a couple of years. I'm going to start to have some issues. And by the time I get to be 70, I'm going to be sick. And then it's going to be up to myself and all my colleagues to take care of me and everyone else like me until I die. And I'm usually not dying in a very nice way because I'm in a hospital. I've got lots of tubes in me, and I've got all kinds of doctors running around me. And that's really what we call the reactive model. And that model is outdated. It's wrong. It's unethical. The proactive model is the 20-year goal. The proactive model is what we're all working on. I think that's what we're all working on in this room. That's what well-being is. That's what they call wellness or well-being. And what I call proactive medicine, longevity medicine, anti-aging medicine, whatever you want to call it. We live to around 95, 100. We have some small issues when we're about 100, but we're still walking around, we're still thinking, we're very sort of on our feet, our balance and proprioception is good. And at about 110, 115, we die in our sleep. And we have a family around us, and we've had a really healthy, long life, and we've breathed really good longevity into the last part of our years. We've really breathed life into our years. not years into our life. So by 65, most of us, almost probably over 60%, will have one chronic disease. By the time we're 75 or 80, we'll have 3. And this leads to, here in Thailand and in every other system in the world, it leads to a humanitarian crisis, much bigger than the humanitarian and healthcare crisis we saw during COVID. This means that healthcare systems collapse. That's a big problem for all of us. So, as I said before, the big ones, the big 3, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, and osteoporosis. My colleague spoke a little bit about some of the constructs that we can see that will tackle some of the others. There's amazing things going on with regenerative medicine, with stem cells, with CAR T. There was amazing news last night on CAR T specifically, which you may have seen. Next slide, please. This is really what we call the causal relationship that allows us to understand why all this happens. So the big things are unhealthy lifestyle, physical activity, poor diet, smoking and alcohol abuse, leading to heightened biometrics, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high fasting, obesity, overweight people. In some parts of the world, this is much more profound than it is in Thailand, but Thailand is catching up. And these lead to medical conditions which ultimately lead to death. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So 20 to 30% of our problem is genetic. Many people now think that genetics are a big part of it. It's actually not. It's the epigenetics that's the biggest part of it. So next slide. 75% of it is where we live, the habits we have. So if we live in a big city with lots of pollution like Bangkok and we don't get a hold of this, especially for our younger people will be infected by that, and they will live shorter lives just on the back of the pollution itself. How much we exercise, even going out for a walk every day, just a nice walk, 10,000 steps, just a nice brisk walk every day, 3 times a week. If you can do that, you're going to lengthen your life. Even frail people can benefit, and that's why if you live in China and you live in Taipei and you see people in the park in the morning and they're making praying mantis mannerisms, those people are the people that can stand, and those are the people that have very good proprioception. They're much less likely to fall, and fall, as you know, if you fall more than once and you're in your 70s and you break something, you're more predicted to die over the next 2 years than if you don't. You're actually 50% higher mortality after that fall. And of course, the simple ones. You stop smoking, you reduce your alcohol intake. There is some evidence that drinking moderate amounts of red wine can be good for you. Again, I stress the moderate. Reducing your stress, making sure that your stress levels are low, and sleeping. Sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night for everyone, even if they say, I can get off with 4 hours, that's wrong. You need to rest your body, you need to rest your cells, because as you get older, we'll talk about resiliency. Resiliency is what's lost as we get older, and we want to keep ourselves young. So how do we keep ourselves young? We keep them resilient. Next slide. So this is what really happens to cause all of those instabilities. We get what are the damage and errors. We won't go into a lot of detail here, but these are the main systems that are in disrepair and cause us to have a systemic shift at the level of the cell. And the cell can't come back to life the way it does when we're young. You can see that just on a cut on your hand. If you cut your hand and you have a little skin wound. For my 6-year-old, that wound, it looks perfect in a day, right? Day and a half, it looks great. But in us, it takes a week. When we get older, when in our 50s and 60s, it just doesn't work the same way. It doesn't come back together the same way. And that's across all our systems. Next slide, please. So this, again, is what we were speaking about. 25% of us is hereditary. That means our genes. And that's responsible for how long we live and how we live. 75% of us is our environment. So that's how we, the things that are around us, ionizing radiation, even low-frequency electromagnetic fields, smoking and drinking, all cause this thing that we call metabolic errors, which lead to these systems on the left, scavenging, repair and recovery, removal and replacement, all being out of whack. And as a consequence, we have impairment of our removal systems and what we call a homeostasis or balance disorder. And that throws things off. That means that our resiliency is less. That means that we have a decreased adaptive capacity of the body and we begin to age. And that happens from the time we're about 25. Then we get age-related diseases and we die. Sorry to be so verbose, but that's what it is. As we go on, next slide, I get excited about the future. Next slide. So over time, if we don't get killed by cancer, by CVD or BUS, our ability to confront complex metabolic and structural problems after disruption decreases. And as we age, our blood counts or step counts decline predictably and incrementally. We don't allow those blood counts and those step counts to return to baseline. So our human resilience, or our cellular resilience, is actually declining. But we know that there's now an upper limit of about 120 years, but we expect that in the next 20 to 30 years, that will increase to about 150 years, which means our resilience, based on all the technology and all the medical constructs that we have and the understanding of aging, will lead us to longer life. So we hope we can overcome this resilience with an amazing number of new technologies. Next slide, please. So here is where I think the paradigm shift is. Where we live normally now, we have our education, our career, and our retirement. That's going to change. We're going to be born, we're going to have an education, we're going to have a career, we're going to have more education, we're going to have more education, we're going to have another career, and we're never going to retire because we're not going to want to. And science is going to show us that by keeping our brains active and keeping all of our loved ones around us and happy, we're going to live longer and much more productive lives, and that's what we call productive longevity. And if you look at Dr. Sinclair, a colleague of mine, and Dr. Scott, they talk a lot about this. It's an incredible miracle. For every 10 years of increased, for every 1 year, we can extrapolate to 10, of increased lifespan, we're talking about a $36 trillion increase in productive longevity or economies. Next slide. It's all been happening as a consequence of the work of the last 12, 13 years. We started with stem cell therapies in 2009, 2010. You can see some of the targets, mTOR, CRISPR, AI in medicine, functional MRI, aging clocks, Horvath clock, genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics that my colleague was talking about, Mahidol. Clinical trials for many of these constructs, telemedicine, the advent of monitoring on your wristwatch through Apple and others, trials for things like metformin, off-license uses of medicine. We're going to see much, much more of that. It's an amazing time to get older, and it's an amazing time as we learn this science to inform all of us. Next slide, please. So the future, again, is very bright. Medicine and science are making huge advances, AI in medicine. I've just gotten back to Korea, where I'm working with an amazing AI startup called Mind AI, which I believe will reshape the way we look at AI and we look at big data, specifically in medicine. We'll be using genomics and proteomics. We'll be using aging clocks and longitudinal diagnostics. We'll be understanding gerontology. We'll be understanding the science of getting old in a much more profound way. And ultimately, telemedicine, wearables, drug discovery, gene and cell therapy, and biobanks will be part of all of our lives. Next slide, please. The modern medicine today is reactive, but the modern medicine of the future, we hope, will be proactive. And what I talk about at the bottom are some of the medicines of the future. Gene therapy, the geroprotectors, data-driven individualized anticipation and predictive screening and diagnostics, data-driven therapies. We talked a little bit about being able to know whether a drug is going to be specific to you. There's lots of businesses around the world that are doing this now. Most of them are doing it for profit. I hope that some of that will trickle down. In Thailand, I think it is. In France, it is as well. Diet is more and more important. I hope that we will be looking at diet very closely in Thailand. And physical and mental stress management. I can't stress enough how much physical and mental stress is impacting all of us. Next slide. Again, these are what a future prescription might look like. mTOR is one of the inhibition medicines targeted by rapamycin. You can read a lot about NAD. You see all over the place, but NAD does deplete over time. We can eliminate the senescent cells, the aging cells, using senolytics, and we can, of course, use stem cells ethically and guided by proper and properly trained teams. Next slide, please. This is actually the hand of one of my children, and I think of this as the reason, my personal reason to do this. But I'm, of course, a physician, so I do this for all of us. But I want to be around to be able to see them as long as I can. And I always put this gentleman up. He died at 106. He was a cardiac surgeon out at Loma Linda in California. I also trained in cardiac surgery. And he was still operating at 96. And he was a vegan, an absolutely remarkable man. And one of the reasons that Blue Zones, and I'm sure you've heard about Blue Zones, I'm going to be working with Blue Zones as well, is in the space that they are now in the world. He's one of the people that formed it. Next slide. No next slide? There it is. Through our great good fortune in youth, with our hearts were touched with fire, it was given to us to learn at the outset that life is a profound and passionate thing. And that was said by Oliver Wendell Holmes, a great thinker. And I'm happy to take any questions. I realize that for lack of time, I may not have anything. I'm at 16 minutes, but I'm happy to take any questions that you have. None. Looking forward to hopefully seeing you all again at some point. Of course. Yes, sir. Probably the most important thing you can do day to day, yes, sir. Correct. I don't know that I've referenced as very clearly. It's an idea. It's definitely an idea. And the reason that I actually talk about the cardiac surgeon who died at 106, he was a clear vegan. I'm not a vegan, and I don't expect to be a vegan. But I do believe that over these next years, many more of us will become vegan. Please. It doesn't.
The body systems to use the best out of it, right? So if you can tell a little bit more about it, how people can know what is good for them.
One of the great ways to do this is...
Thank you.
Not at all, sir. One of the great ways to do this is really to look at your specific food intolerances and allergies. It's also the way to look at your biomarkers as you metabolize food and what works for you. If you're doing this on a 3-monthly basis and you start with a whole group of specific biomarkers to see how those affect you and how that affects your digestive system, but all your other systems, your blood pressure, etc., I can tell you from evidence that we've seen people coming in with complex metabolic syndrome, that have been prescribed all sorts of medicines. And I've been on a conference call led out of the National University of Singapore in the last few weeks, where a overweight man, was diagnosed with, and given years to live, basically, if he didn't stop. And he said, I don't want to do this on medicine. And he was able to exercise and eat his way out of the metabolic syndrome. So this is possible. Diet is behind most of what we can correct. Of course, there are certain things that we can't. And I say that, I say as a medic, as a surgeon, we have to take certain things out in order to get them better. But we can do an enormous amount with our bodies. I hope I answer you that question, because it's a complex question. I can talk to you off panel.
Just one remark, because it's very interesting, because I have patients who are vegans, they get cancer. And I have people who are, how to say, they abuse meat, let's call it that way, no any problems.
Sure.
It seems like it really depends, it's very individual, essentially. Yeah.
Well, it's also what we discussed.
Yeah.
25% of us versus 75% of them.
Yeah.
So that 25%, and you know that the Knudsen triple hit hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
You know what that means. You just have to have 2 of those or 3 of those that happen to coincide, and that P53 gene is doing its thing. and then you have a problem. And there isn't much that diet and or exercise is going to do for that. Now, once it's happened, is there a way to help it to get better? There is. But that, again, is you're reactive at that point. And that's why so much of what we need to do is screening and being proactive.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Thank you.